Hello, bookworms. So it's another book review from me, and I want to review a book that I've been reading called Islam and Nihilism, My Poison and My Cure by Yusuf Ponders. So, I was quite interested in this subject. Islam is obviously the religion of Islam. Nihilism is this idea that the world is meaningless, that there is no point, no, that there is no ultimate meaning in life, and that life is ultimately meaningless. I'll just read the back here. It's written by a guy called Yusuf Ponders, he's a researcher and the Sapiens Institute's Lighthouse Mentoring Manager. He's a first-class BA in philosophy. His focus has been mainly on nihilism and the meaning of life, for which he wrote a dissertation and made many videos discussing the subject. Blah, blah, blah. He runs a YouTube channel called Pondering Soul, which focuses on philosophy and theology. So in this book, the author seeks to make clear the growing problem of nihilism prevalent throughout the world, the feeling of the meaninglessness of life, and how this has more and more people in its grip. And okay, so basically, nihilism is this idea that there is no actual meaning to life, that the ultimate point is that it is meaningless. And some people would say that, it's meaningless, so you shouldn't even feel depressed about it, because that's meaning as well. So there isn't any ultimate meaning to life. Yusuf Ponders argues the point that there is a meaning to life. There is ultimate truth, and that it's not just the idea of your perspective and my perspective. So he talks a lot. His own personal journey was that he was, I don't know what he was doing, and then he went to Thailand. He was living a pretty hedonistic lifestyle, or tried to, and find a point to that. I think he was doing a job, and then he thought, what's the point of that? And then he went off to Thailand. And then eventually he looked into various religions and decided to take up Islam. His point is that there is an ultimate meaning, and he's found it through Islam. Now, he talks about Islam, obviously, as his kind of way out of the point of meaninglessness. But I could see how, if in a way, some of the things he talks about religion in general. So I could see that you could find that through other religions as well, although he makes the case for Islam. So that is there in this book. However, he talks a lot about nihilism and says, well, why is it important? So one of the reasons he says that nihilism is important as a subject is because when people do feel that there is no ultimate meaning to life, a lot of people will think, well, what's the point? I might as well go and kill, 20, 30 people and then shoot myself at the end of it, or go drown 10 puppies or 10 people, and who cares? Because there's no point to life, ultimately. And so he says that also when people commit suicide, they have an experience of meaninglessness, of pointlessness, like they don't think there's a point to life, there's no actual meaning. And so they think, well, might as well just end it now. So they do. And he explains that that's why he thinks that there's also a reason for the increase in the number of suicides. Now, he gives a figure of something like a city the size of Leeds every year commits suicide, and that's over the whole world. And that's not including the people that try to commit suicide. I'm talking about the people that successfully commit suicide, but the people that try to commit suicide, or maybe think about it or whatever, which would be much bigger. So he says it's a real problem. And I did remember reading a statistic that, from ages of 15 to 25, the number of young men killing themselves has increased about 4 or 5-fold. You can argue about why that might be. So he talks about the rise of this idea of meaninglessness as a philosophy. And he does talk about people like Richard Dawkins, and people who, like the four horsemen of the new atheists and everything. And they would all talk about there is no point, there is no meaning to religion, and initially, and he says that this idea has been kind of promoted for a while, but he says that the philosophers that promoted this were people like Schopenhauer, I think, who committed suicide, and then people like Friedrich Nietzsche, who wrote this book called Man and Superman, and basically said that essentially in Europe, the Christian God has been killed. So it's been killed, and people have lost what tethered them and gave them morals. So in other words, that he describes this idea that the sun has been untethered and it's gone further and further away. And he talks about the fact that what's left then, if you don't have God as your ultimate value, who do you take as the arbiter of what is meaningful? In other words, it might be you. So you have to find your own way. You become essentially your own God. You become God. And what do you base your principles on? It may be pleasure or pain, or it just may be your own ultimate idea or your truth. In other words, there's no ultimate truth. There's your truth. There's your truth. There's my truth. You do you. It's a selfish way of looking at the world. And he talks about how, ultimately, even if you say, well, the world is all about us, and it's about us as humanity or the universe or whatever, is there something beyond that? And that's where he feels that nihilism falls down. And he describes it as a sickness. He describes it as a sickness that has to be counteracted. Interestingly enough, Nietzsche also described the idea of nihilism as a temporary sickness. He also talks about another book called Man's Search for Meaning by a guy called Viktor Frankl. And if you ever go to a lot of personal development courses, Viktor Frankl's always quoted. Viktor Frankl, The Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl was a really interesting guy. He was a guy who was in a concentration camp. He was a Jewish guy. I could have been Auschwitz. And he narrowly escaped being killed because he took all of his clothes and jumped into a van that had loads of corpses in it. The corpses were transported out to be buried in a mass grave, and he, in the dead of night, ran away by pretending to be a corpse. He got to America, became a psychologist, and he wrote this book called Man's Search for Meaning. And his idea is that man is a creature that has an impulse to meaning, an impulse to purpose, that man is driven to purpose. In other words, he's a meaning-making machine, which I totally get. And I get that we do have subjective meanings. We do that. But the author will talk about how it's important to have shared meaning as well. And without shared meaning, there is no societal cohesion. So he talks about society being broken down. You can talk all you want about that, and yeah, that could become, in the wrong hands, a kind of fascist society, and I can totally see how that would happen. So there has to be some tolerance of different views, otherwise how would that work? Anyway, there is a point about the book, which is not this one, The Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, which I will do a review on because I've read it. But in it, some of the people that give up in the concentration camps and just give up and just resign themselves to their fate, he describes them as Muslims, which I thought was interesting. And I've asked people before about this, and I've said, where did that come from? Muslims aren't that. But I think personally that the idea is that he describes them in almost kind of racist way, that the Muslims are fatalistic. They just take their fate. And yeah, Muslims do believe in fate, but they also believe that you have choice and free will to do what you want to do. So I think that was a bit unfair about the book Search for Meaning, but that's for another time. Anyway, he talks about that. He also this guy Yusuf talks about the idea of truth and techno-hypnosis, that people are trying to escape the world by escaping into technology, their phones, PlayStation. They're trying to distract themselves from life. And really what that is it's a huge disconnect. It's a disconnect between people. And I think we all know that. If you sit down at at the dinner table and 5 people are on their phone. How annoying is that? Of course, there's a disconnect. He talks about a fractured society in that, and I get that if you have this idea that there's no meaning, if you're in a bad place, that's a great thing. Because if you think that the world is empty and meaningless, you then are free to create meaning, and you can create a powerful meaning rather than a disempowering meaning. That is great. But what if you're a guy that likes to, I don't know, drown puppies or flipping kill people or something, or you're a serial killer? Then if you read that, okay, the life is empty and meaningless, that's pretty damn good, because then you can do whatever you want, indulge your desires, and it doesn't really mean anything other than the punishment that might come. Yes, there's consequences, but ultimately that's meaningless as well, because you're all going to die. That is the bit of a problem that I have with it, that it can lead to certain other things. So anyway, he talks about values in British society. He makes the point that a lot of the morals in British society are not intuitive. They're actually inherited, and they're inherited from the sort of faith in God. So he says that if you throw out this idea of meaninglessness and religion, then you're going to throw out some of these morals ultimately as well. And the reason that they're still around is because they've been inherited, it takes a while for them to decay. But ultimately you will get to that point where it'll be, I don't know, The Purge, like that movie where you have one day where you can kill everybody and it's okay. That can quite easily happen. He also makes the point that faith is a part of life, whether it's this, you look at the world in terms of science. If you're an atheist, you still have to deal with faith. You believe that there are 12 people sitting in the cabinet in number 10 Downing Street who are deciding everything perfectly well for us here. You have to have faith that they're going to do that in that process. And yes, you can get rid of them, but ultimately there is faith in a process. So he basically talks about that. He also talks about this metaphor that, by destroying this idea of truth, you are essentially like destroying the roots of a tree and hoping that it'll improve the tree. So he's saying that by getting rid of religion, you are actually ultimately going to destroy society as well. So that was kind of interesting. He does talk about something intuitive, which he calls the fitra. Now, fitra is a Arabic term, and it means an innate disposition. And what he says is that man has an innate disposition to worship. You're going to worship something, whether it's science, whether it's money, fame, whatever. You are going to worship something. Maybe it's the family, but you're going to worship something. So I think that's where his idea is, that then the highest value, what is the highest value? What is next? And he argues that the next has to be God. Whatever you can imagine, there has to be something beyond that. And actually, he gives an interesting idea about the phrase Allahu Akbar. God is not greatest, God is greater. So this idea that whatever you can imagine, God is greater than that. Most people, when you see Allahu Akbar, it's usually a Hollywood movie where somebody's got a tea towel on his head and he's about to throw a bomb. But actually, the actual term means God is greater. So the idea is that whatever you can imagine, or whatever there's something greater than that. Anyway, he said that some people just think that there's almost like too much choice in the modern world, that even with the idea of religions, people think there's too much choice, so they just don't look at anything at all. So there's a kind of analysis paralysis. So he talks about that as well. Anyway, ultimately, the whole point of the book is that essentially, if life is ultimately meaningless, then all the money, all the fame, all the struggle, what's the point of it, right? And he's saying that there is a point of it, because if the point of life is just to have this one glorious moment of fabulosity, then a lot of people are going to think, well, actually, what is the point of that? So he's saying that there's an alternative. And for him, his alternative was Islam. But I must admit, I did read this and I could see that, you could look at other religions and say, well, for me, that is the point. There's something transcendental. There's something that transcends this world, this life, this solar system. And I suppose that's what most people with a world faith are going to say. So his conclusion of his book is that Islam is a viable alternative to nihilism. Why? Because it provides meaning and purpose from birth to death and beyond. I must admit, reading this book, one of the things I did think was, could he have changed the name of the book to Religion and Nihilism? And would that have worked just as well? So it might have done. And I think I can see why, if people take on religion, there is a whole point to it. There's a point to religion. It provides a framework, it provides meaning, it provides purpose, which we need. We can't do without meaning and purpose. We cannot live in a meaningless world. And if you get to that point, it's a transitory, it's a temporary station. And Nietzsche thought that as well. But some people think, well, meaninglessness means you can sort of basically do whatever you can get away with. Yeah, I did think to myself, well, does that mean you could get that meaning out of, say, a martial art, playing an instrument, playing a sport, something like that? Yes, you probably could for a while. So in your younger days, you could probably get it by devoting yourself to something. But at some point, if you're going to look further, that's probably going to run out. And then what is the value? So I can see why it's difficult to get away from religion. You are going to have that idea. Yeah, so you're going to have to turn to something inexplicable, something transcendent. Anyway, I thought this was a really interesting book. I actually read this twice because I had to kind of deal with some of the concepts and think about it. But essentially what that is for him, religion was the answer. He found that in Islam, and the idea that life is ultimately pointless and meaningless. And he felt that no, that it's not pointless and meaningless. There is an ultimate truth, not just your truth, my truth. But he says you do have to do a bit of work on it, and you do have to look for it. And that it's not enough to just say, well, there's too much choice out there, I'm just going to sit here and not do it. You do have to look for it. That is the point. So Islam and Nihilism, My Poison and My Cure by Yusuf Ponders. I hope you found that interesting. I certainly found this book interesting. And you may well have stuff to say about it. Okay, take care. Until the next review.